Good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone here. Some of you I have not met, and I look forward to meeting you later. I'm here for Thanksgiving with my family. We come to visit my family for an entire week. And I'm wondering, what are y'all doing for Thanksgiving? Anybody have any plans? Are you going to be with your families? Okay. Eat a lot of food? Gather together. That's really nice. That's great. You know, every holiday has a story behind it. For example, what's the story behind Christmas? That's the birth of Jesus. Y'all know that. Thanksgiving also has a story behind it. Does anyone know what that story is? The familiar one is that many, many years ago, English people came to America at that time and met the indigenous folks who lived here. There's several different signs that you can use to sign indigenous. So the English did not know how to plant or grow crops. They were in danger of starving. The indigenous people took pity on them and taught them how to grow crops, and they became friendly. So they got together and had a big gathering and a feast and a huge celebration at harvest time. Now that's the traditional Thanksgiving story. Have you heard that story before? I see lots of yeses. Yeah, many of us grew up with that story, right? And we heard that every year in school. That's the American story that's been passed on for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, there is also a very dark story that was happening simultaneously that a lot of people are not aware of. They know that sweet, good story. But that story masks a darker story that has been shoved into the shadows because we want to focus on the good. The dark story is that of Europeans coming to America, taking the land, slaughtering the indigenous people, spreading disease, marginalizing the people whose land it was, forcing them to be moved away from their land into smaller, separated colonies. These people who had taught the Europeans how to grow their crops were all of a sudden marginalized, and their fertile land was taken over by the Europeans. So the places that they were forced to move to were infertile. They could not grow enough food for their own needs, and they, the indigenous people, were all of a sudden in danger of starving. Now, we all have that story of the Europeans and the indigenous folks becoming friends, but the indigenous story is much different. The Europeans were oppressive. They tortured the indigenous folks. And then they oppressed them so much that their voices were silent and they were swept aside. And the Europeans said, of course, we're good people. We have good history. And that's the story that was passed on. And that's the story that we have swallowed without delving any deeper into. The indigenous folks had a horrible life after the Europeans came. They didn't have technology, and our story is that we brought them all of these modern conveniences, technology and textiles and things like that. Our story is that these folks were savages. They didn't even know Jesus Christ, and so we had come from Europe to save the lives of the indigenous people so that they could become more civilized. They could have textiles, they could have technology, and they could know about God and know about Jesus. That's the story that's been passed down in our culture. And what really happened has been swept aside so that we can know that, oh yeah, we're good people, we've got good history. that story. When the Europeans came here, we actually made the indigenous people's lives worse. We did not enrich their lives. We did not make them better. And we don't know their story. Their story was in direct opposition to the Americans' stories. Because the European story is that the wealthy, powerful people came here to America to help the natives. And so the Europeans got lots of accolades for sharing their wealth and showing that they were good people. But in the indigenous people's eyes, this was nothing that was good. The Europeans that came in were not saving them, were not helping them, so their story is in direct opposition to the European story. You know, it's important for us when we celebrate Thanksgiving. In our culture, it's the European story that gets passed down, the story of wealth and aid. And I want to challenge us to try and look at the story of the oppressed. Listen to the indigenous people's stories. Because the wealthy Europeans just wanted to make themselves feel good that they were helping these other people, when actually they were contributing and actually causing starvation and poverty throughout the indigenous world because of their actions. So I want us to turn our attention to the voices of the marginalized, of the oppressed, of the indigenous folks, of their stories, and understand that the Europeans, even though they were wealthy, they did not use their wealth to assist the native people. So don't turn your focus only to that story that we have heard for years and years. We need to listen to the story of those folks who are marginalized. Now there's one professor, Guiliano Gutierrez, and he wrote a paper called The Eruption of the Poor. I'm going to sign this like this. That means that people who are poor, let me expand on this just a bit. The stories of the people who are in poverty, their way of thinking is in direct opposition to those who are in power and wealthy. The powerful and the wealthy story is a story that has been broadcast and publicized far and wide, and it's the story that we follow. Let me give you a couple of examples here. When you watch the news, you always see a lot of information about the economy being bad. And everyone, including poor people, are now like freaked out about the fact that the economy is bad. Now when I look at this, when I look at those who are living in poverty, I say, hey, the economy is always bad for you. But the news media says, oh, this economy is bad. And they say that it's bad for everyone, but it's not. It's the same as it's always been for those who have been in poverty. The people who are suffering from this are those who are wealthy, those who are losing their $1 million bonus checks, even though they still have plenty of money in their pockets. You know, and it's not good for the poor people anyway. And when the economy is good, it does not affect those who live in poverty. It's for those who are already wealthy. And the media will talk so much about the history and schools and education and all the stories that we have had handed down to us. And those stories were all from the viewpoint of the rich and powerful. Do you know the history of the U.S.? You don't know the history of the U.S. until you read a book called The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. This book goes into detail about how the United States have oppressed those who are poor and how poor people have resisted that oppression. How strikes happened, how poor people rebelled against those who were wealthy, how immigrants coming to this land experienced oppression and had horrible lives, and how they stood up against that because they wanted to have all the rights of any American citizen. There are stories upon stories in this book. And do you guys know any of them? No. We know about George Washington. We know about Abraham Lincoln. They're our heroes. Did you know that Lincoln supported slavery? There's a lot of things that we are not taught. And the reason this happens is the most prevalent story that we hear over and over again is not from those of the poor, from those who are persecuted. It's from those who are wealthy and powerful. Gutierrez says in his eruption of the poor that those who are poor, that their stories need to be proclaimed and broadcast far and wide. And we need to eradicate and get rid of the story of the rich and powerful. The world needs to know the stories of those who are in poverty because they are in direct opposition to the stories of the wealthy, but they are in total alignment with the stories of Jesus and Jesus' mission. From Luke chapter 4, verses 17 through 21, this is Jesus speaking. He's come to the Nazarenes. That was his hometown, was in Nazareth. That's where he grew up. And this evidently is the first time that he came to speak out to the masses, or to the public. You know, when Jesus was growing up, he never preached. He may have had some discussions, but he had not started his formal ministry until he was approximately 30 years old. And he began that in his hometown. So I want you to have that in mind and imagine Jesus coming into the Nazarene synagogue. And maybe everybody looked around and said, oh yeah, this is Jesus. We remember you when you were just a tot. Oh, you were so cute. And now you're just this great big guy. I'm sure Jesus was like, yeah, I'm sure. He said, hey, you know, I know your dad. Your dad and I were in the same class in high school. And, oh, I can tell you stories about your dad. I'm sure Jesus went through all of this because everybody knew who he was. They watched him grow up, and here he was, 30 years old and ready to begin his ministry. So he goes into his home church, so to speak. He stands up, all eyes are on him, and the congregation is saying, is that Jesus? Is that Joseph's kid? I think so. He can read and write. Oh, let's see what he's got to say. So everybody was watching him with anticipation. You know what happened after he was done? Did they say, oh, I'm so proud of you, you've grown up to be such a fine young man, and embrace him? Do you think that's what happened? No. They wanted to kill Jesus. They were ready to stone him. They were ready to push him off of a cliff. So what did Jesus say that made all of those folks so angry that they wanted to murder him? You know, Jesus didn't go off on his own and making up stuff. Jesus' message was very simple, and it came from the book of Isaiah. All he did was open the scroll and read from Isaiah. And it infuriated the masses so much they wanted to kill him. Jesus read from Isaiah, and he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me. He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has appointed me to proclaim freedom to the captives. He has anointed me to help the blind see. I've been anointed to save the oppressed. This is the year of the Lord. This is when this will come to pass." Well, that infuriated everybody, and they were ready to kill him. But let's dive a little deeper into this. He was preaching good news to the poor people, which was in direct opposition to the story of the powerful. Because their story was that these folks are poor because it's their own fault. They don't work hard enough. They don't try to move up the ladder. They don't even attempt to become wealthy. And we work really hard, which is how we got our wealth. But that is not a fact. So Jesus interrupted that story. He said, "I came to proclaim release to the captives, freedom for those who are imprisoned." And that interrupts the story of what the wealthy said, which was that those who are imprisoned are absolutely worthless. They did wrong. It's their own fault that they're there. They deserve it. They're in these small cells. Well, that's just too bad for them. Their own actions made it that way. So what if they can't call their family and friends? They're being punished. So what if they're lonesome? And you guys know if deaf people are in prison, they are in such worse shape. And nobody really cares. The community says, well, it's their fault, they deserve it. But Jesus would say no. Being in prison is one of the most demeaning things you can do to people. But these folks are not worthless. There are lots of people along the hierarchy that we look down on that are also not worthless. They deserve their rights. They deserve to have a good life. And that's what Jesus said. Jesus also said that he was there to give blind people their sight. Now, you guys know this story so well, and the deaf people know this story, of course. Because people look down on deaf folks and say, oh, deaf people can't hear, well, that's too bad. And deaf people say, wait a second, I just need an interpreter. We just need captioning. We just need access. And the public at large says, well, sorry, it's not our problem, it's y'all's problem. Bring your own interpreters. Oh, if you don't have an interpreter, well, I guess that's too bad for you. You just figure it out on your own. Oh, you don't have access? Well, sorry, that's not my fault. It's your fault. You deaf folks need to deal with it, not us. But Jesus said, no. You know what? Blind people can see if we provide them with sight. In John chapter 6, Jesus and the disciples are walking. They see a man who's been born blind sitting by the side of the road begging. And they ask, who sinned? Who caused this man to be blind? Was it his parents who sinned? Or was it something he did that caused him to be blind? And just think about that. Doesn't even make sense. Can anybody sin in the womb? But the Jewish people believed that you could sin while you were inside the womb. And that was based on the Jacob and Esau story. Jacob and Esau struggled in their mother's womb. Esau was born first, and Jacob was grasping his heel. Which meant that the the Jewish understanding, they could sin and do something wrong within the womb, and so maybe that's what happened, and that's why this guy was born blind. Jesus' response was, no, neither of these happened. Jesus got rid of that old belief that disabilities are punishments from God. You know, a lot of people, a long time ago, that was just a part of the culture, and it still is. And Jesus responded, neither of these happened. So he destroyed that myth that disability is a punishment from God. And you know what Jesus said next? He said, you must do the work of God. Oh, you think, well, this guy's been punished from God. I'm telling you, his family's bad. You need to stay away from them. Oh, you don't want to talk about that woman either. They're nothing but trouble. You know how the gossip goes. You know, even people always talk about what people have done wrong. But Jesus' response was, you do the work of God. Day by day. So Jesus went ahead and gave the blind man his sight. And there are several stories throughout Scripture where Jesus tries to show us and teaches his children. He says, see this blind man, he's living in poverty, he's begging along the side of the road because he's blind. At least that's what you all think. But you know what? You all are wrong. Look at him. Know that he is just fine the way he is, and give him the assistance he needs that he can be successful. You know, in Mark 7, there's the story of the deaf man when Jesus heals a man who's deaf. People read that and think, oh, it's a miracle because this deaf man can't hear. So, yeah, maybe he could hear, but he couldn't communicate. So he was lost. You know, I've seen many of you have deaf kids that maybe have implants, and they can hear, but they still can't communicate well. They're still lonesome. And people say, well, look, they've got the implants, they can hear now, they're fine. But when deaf people meet these kids, they know that they do not have freedom of expression. They know that they're inwardly lonely. Y'all know that. So what Jesus would do, once he performed that miracle, was he done? He was not. It says what Jesus did was Jesus gave the deaf man a voice. And immediately, the man could talk fluently. Now, you deaf folks know that when the first time you get hearing aids or cochlear implants, that you're not able to talk fluently. It takes lots and lots of speech therapy and drill and learning how to blow Kleenexes. Y'all grew up with that, right? At least most of us did. And we still struggle to speak. But Jesus did give the man his hearing, but he also gave the man the ability to speak fluently, which means he gave the man language. The most important thing in this story is not the hearing acuity, but the fact that the man had language. And you know, people would think, well, oh, it's right that the deaf people are isolated and that the blind people are beggars. But that is not true. The public and the masses that say these things are the ones who are mistaken. They are the ones who need to include these folks. So Jesus absolutely eradicated the common thought about disabilities in his work in his life. You know, historically, we look at marginalized people, those who are BIPOC, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color, deaf people, people with disabilities, females. You know, society has looked down on all of these classes of people as second-class folks. No discussion about it. Jesus interrupts that and says, oh, excuse me, no. Jesus says the first will be last and the last will be first. Which means those folks that you have thought are in horrible, low on the totem pole people are going to be moved up to places of prominence. They will be first. So you can see Jesus' ministry interrupted all of these cultural stories that they had. And if Jesus came today, oh, Jesus is going to interrupt us big time, for sure. You know, as Jesus came in and interrupt the ways the culture was thinking and reacting, you have to think about Jesus' ministry. And the biggest thing that he did to interrupt the world story was that Jesus came as a person. And who was Jesus? Jesus was the embodiment of God in a human body. Before Jesus came, people would talk incessantly about who God was. And in their view, God supported the rich and the wealthy and the powerful, the kings, the royalty of old. And that has been the story throughout human history. Well, now that's certainly not as prevalent as it was. But many cultures believed that God selected the kings. And that the kings were put in places of power to rule. And that they had all the rights in the world, that they could take anything they wanted in the world. That if they wanted to kill someone, they had the right to do so. Because God had called them to be God's kings on earth. And so many of the kings were very oppressive. They colonized poor folks, they took their resources, they slaughtered them. And the general public believed that story, that God had chosen them. That God was on the side of those who were wealthy and powerful. But God, in a flash, came into a human body to proclaim to all of us, y'all have been talking about who I am, y'all have been wrong. You think that I'm on the side of the rich and the powerful? I am not. I am here to support and to bolster up those who are poor and lowly. Think about it. God was born in a stable. I grew up in poverty. I stand with those who are poor and oppressed. Those are the ones who know God. So when Jesus came in human form, that was the biggest interruption he could possibly have done to the story of the world. Because Jesus came to earth, and that was the most significant event in our human history. Anything that happened from there on, any of our discussions about God, cannot say that God is on the side of the rich and wealthy and powerful, because we have Jesus. Jesus incarnate, to prove without a doubt that God stands with those who are poor and oppressed. When I look at the church, I see communities of people who are committed to following Jesus, to following Jesus' teaching, Jesus' actions, all that Jesus has. And you know what Jesus did? He interrupted most of society's stories. And so we should be doing the same. We should be interrupting the world's stories. You know, there are so many stories throughout the world that need to be interrupted. And one of those stories is that of oddism. The story of oddism. Do you know the term of oddism? You know racism. It's discrimination against people because of the color of their skin. You know about sexism, meaning discrimination against people because of their gender, those who are not male. you know the isms. Well, odd ism is one of them. And that's discrimination against people who have hearing loss. Those who are deaf are looked down upon, right? Yeah. Many of you know this firsthand. And that's been prevalent throughout our history. And people believed the story that deaf people needed to be subjugated to hearing people. And deaf people believe that story as well. You know, this is something that's kind of a pet peeve for me. I'm going to give you an example here. You know, when people are talking on the news again, and I will watch the news and think, well, I don't think that's right. And they say, well, my hearing friend told me this is true. And I say, oh, you know, if your hearing friend told you, well, I guess it's gotta be true, right? And no, not necessarily. You know that for so many years, deaf people did not realize that they had their own language. They thought that sign was just broken English, that it wasn't a real language at all until the 1960s. When one man who was a hearing professor at William Stokey was working with two deaf, Carl Cronenberg and Dorothy Castleman. The three of them worked together and realized after studying the deaf students at Gallaudet that their language was actually a language. It had all the aspects of a bona fide language, so they set up the first language linguistics lab at Gallaudet University to study sign language as an independent language, and they met with a lot of ridicule. They said, why do you study sign language? They need to be learning how to sign English, and what they're signing is just a broken form of English. However, their research found that it was a bona fide language that had no connection with English whatsoever. And once deaf people realized that they had their own language, they started to feel a sense of pride and esteem that they had never felt before. Prior to that, they had bought into the story that sign language was not worthy. And now I want to talk about the church and deaf churches. You know, we've got to band together and interrupt the stories that hearing people have about deaf folks being second class. But specifically, I want to talk about the church now. Now, you know, I grew up in a deaf church. My mom's a pastor. You know, I've got lots of memories of deaf churches and preachers, and it was fine if hearing people were there, you know. It was still fun. But our stuff was still kept in a closet. You know, we were generally shoved off into an old building where there was mouse feces everywhere. And they wouldn't allow us to use the nice areas. And I look back at that and I just think, wow, that wasn't right. But you know, we had it better than a lot of deaf churches, I know that. But one common denominator of all deaf churches is that they take and imitate hearing churches. Let me give you examples. Music. Now, I'm not saying get rid of music, because some people really enjoy listening, some deaf people enjoy listening to music. But you know, here, I enjoy how we all sign with the music. And the signing is expressive, the words are on the screen, the rhythm comes through. And I remember a long time ago, you know, going to different churches, you know, and still today I go to a lot of different churches. When it's time to sing, you know, somebody will come up, they'll look down at their paper and they'll sing, "Praise the Lord, from heaven on earth let angels come." And that's what it'll look like. ASL. You know, deaf people have ASL as their language, not English. And often people will just try and do it right in English. And sometimes people will sign, Jesus is my staff. And they'll use a sign, English sign for staff that means a staff person, instead of the concept of a staff as a rod and staff. And another example is liturgy. Oh my gosh, liturgy is like from the Church of England English. And people will look at it and they won't feel anything. But a lot of deaf people feel like we need to have liturgy because it's been passed on, it's a tradition from the church, and so we cannot interrupt or break that tradition. Think about it. Theology has been focusing on the stories of people who can hear, not on the stories of people who are deaf. And so we have appropriated things from hearing culture and hearing church, hearing worship. I know y'all are working hard, and I know you still are, and I know you know this, but I just want to encourage you to keep interrupting the narratives of the hearing culture. You know, this church right here can do that. Why are we imitating hearing worship? Well, maybe some people have internalized the concept that hearing people are better than the deaf. But I'm here to tell you that we've got a lot of things about us and our culture that are better than deaf folk, or hearing folks. And one of those things is sign language. It's a visual language. It's a beautiful language. There was a famous linguist, Noam Chomsky, who came to my university, who came to Princeton to give a lecture. And in his lecture, he was talking about cognition and the multidimensional. You know what multidimensional means? It's like 3D, you know, like when you put on those VR glasses and everything looks like it's coming right at you, and you take them off and it's just 2D again. Well, imagine that the brain is not 2D. The brain thinks in 3D and is very visual. However, spoken language is not multidimensional. It becomes like a flat screen, and it's very linear. Which means when you're trying to express your thoughts, they come into your mind in 3D, but they come out like a spaghetti factory. Linear and two-dimensional. You know, think about how you make spaghetti. You put in all this beautiful mound of dough, and then it gets squished down, and it turns into little spaghetti noodles. Well, at this lecture, someone in the audience asked, is there anyone on earth who has a 3D language? And Noam Chomsky answered immediately, well, yes, sign languages. And that was astounding. If cognition is 3D and sign language is 3D, then can sign language help us express our thoughts more succinctly? And the answer is yes, resoundingly. The world is visual. We can talk about any ideas with people worldwide, but people who don't have sign languages are stuck with these multidimensional thoughts that come out as this linear 2D expression. So much of the richness is lost. Whereas we can take multidimensional thoughts and bring them out in a 3D language without losing anything. So, you know, the world should be watching us, and hearing people should be astounded. And see the benefit of sign language. I really do believe that everyone should learn sign language. I truly do. It's beautiful, it's powerful, it's incredible. You know, and if we are talking in sign language, that helps hearing people understand that there are many, many, many modes of communication, not just through the oral and oral methods. linearly, they can also sign linearly, but those are the folks that get looked down on as if they are inferior and are isolated. But I would say that if we started to interact with those folks, they are intelligent. They have disabilities as well. We can see that they are intelligent and that they do have their own mode of communication. And it's perfect in its way. We just have to learn how these people with additional disabilities communicate, and we need to interact with them and don't think, well, they're isolated because they don't have good language, or they can't express themselves, and that's their problem. I would reframe that to say that's our problem, and we need to accept their manner of communicating. And in the church, we can interrupt the stories and the narratives from the hearing culture. You know, with Thanksgiving, the holiday coming right up. Family is another place that we need to interrupt the traditional stories. You know, think about the dinner table. You know that paradigm? So many deaf people are scared to death of Thanksgiving and holidays, especially the dinners, because the family's going to gather. You know, most of you deaf folks come from hearing families, and, you know, we'll just bear with it and go knock on the door, and they'll open and say, hey, so glad to see you. You're good? Yeah, I'm good. Give you a hug, glad hand you. And then once the hugs and the glad handing is done, after about 5 minutes, the rest of the day, the deaf people gather, or the hearing people gather and talk, and the deaf people are left out. And around the dinner table, it's the same thing. There'll be laughter. The deaf person will say, what's going on? Say, oh, I'll tell you later. Or, never mind, wasn't that funny? And the deaf person doesn't know. And so think about it. When you're around this mass of people, and you have no access to communication, the loneliness is magnified. Much worse than if you had stayed home by yourself. If you stayed home by yourself, without anybody else around, you say, well, I'm lonesome. But when you're with a group of people that don't recognize you, that don't converse with you, that magnifies that feeling. It makes you feel invisible, as if you're not even there, as if you don't even exist. It's a horrendous, horrendous feeling. So I've been trying to figure out how we can interrupt those stories. Well, maybe you need to get a hold of some of your interpreter friends and say, hey, would you mind coming over and interpreting for a couple of hours? And have an interpreter come with you for a couple of hours, interpret, and then the family can realize, oh, I always thought this deaf person really wasn't very smart, but listen to them and have true conversations. You know, and then the family is going to say, can you please stay all day? But you have to set up your boundaries and say, well, you know, I'm going to come to the family gathering for sure, but I've not had any communication all along. So I'm going to only come for dinner, and once we're done with dinner, I'm going to sit off. I'm going to take off. So set your boundary. Because what's been happening all along is not right. Now, some of y'all are fortunate and can have family members who do sign. But they still tend to go into spoken language quite a bit, and sign maybe just a little bit, and then talk, and sign a little. So go ahead and meet with your family and set up a communication policy. You know, just say, hey, it's a fact of life, I'm deaf. I accept that. And don't say, I accept that I can't hear. And don't. That's how you've historically approached it. But don't approach it that way anymore. You don't need to do that. That's a hearing story. You can interrupt that story, and you can just say, hey, we need a communication policy because anytime there's a deaf person in the room, we need to make sure that the communication is accessible. And if someone is talking, then another family member needs to come and interpret. Or you could have 2 rooms, a signing room and a speaking room. And once you go into the signing room, you got to turn your voice off and sign. And the deaf people will know that is a safe place. That is a place that they can be relieved. Those are just some ideas. So you, church, you guys are a community of people that are committed to following the ways of Jesus, Jesus' teaching, Jesus' action. Look at what Jesus did. Look at Jesus' ministry. And he interrupted the stories of the world. And now, the world stories are still being passed down the same way as they always have been. And they say that God is on the side of the rich and the powerful. But Jesus has come to prove once and for all that God is here for the poor and oppressed. So you take that story to the world and start interrupting. And interrupt with the love of God and the message of equality.